Tashidele. First of all, I'd like to extend my warm greetings to all our Dharma friends in Seattle, and I hope everyone is staying safe, well, and happy. Now, my brother Rinpoche requested me to offer a Dharma reflection to the monastery members. And I've been asked before, what exactly do I study here in our Buddhist university? So to put it short, we mainly study the texts of the 18 great treatises of the Nalanda tradition, as we do in the Sakya philosophical tradition. And these cover different subjects, precisely 6 subjects, but they're all based on the 4 Tenet systems. And if I remember correctly, in the monastery, every Sunday during morning Chenrezi, there's this reflection on the 4 philosophical schools that's recited. And so I felt it would be helpful if I could explain a bit about them, if any of you have ever wondered what they exactly are. And also in the monastery, in the shrine hall above, there are these paintings of the 6 ornaments and 2 supreme ones, as they're called, and who are the pioneers of the Nalanda tradition. And it's their texts that we learn to study about the 4 Tenet systems. So this is not a history class as such, as that's not the focus of our studies, but I'll just be introducing what I've learned on these 4 philosophical schools, or Tenet systems, as I think would be more accurate. And I feel it's important to remember that although they differ in views and interpretations, all 4 of these schools, these Tenet systems, are all still followers of the Buddhist dispensation, and they all accept the 4 axioms. So of the 4, the first 2 are Shavagayana, which is synonymous to Hinayana, and the latter 2 are Mahayana, for the Bodhisattva path. So the first one, the first Tenet system, is called Vaibhashika, which means advocates of differentiation or abstraction, because of how they view the material world and how they use abstract concepts. So the Vaibhashika has its roots in the Abhidhamma teachings from early times, but later on developed into a philosophical school, mainly influenced by Vasubandhu. And before he converted to Mahayana, he taught according to this Tenet system. And so the defining characteristics of the Vaibhashika, what they advocate, is what's called the 5 foundations for what is to be known, which are form, mind states, mental events, non-concurrent formatives, and uncompounded phenomena. And so these 5 basically cover everything that exists, according to them. And so they have this uncommon inclusion of the 4th, the non-concurrent formative, which means formatives that aren't associated with any mind states or mental events, meaning basically abstract concepts such as time, persons, names, life, and so forth. And so these are all substantiated, which no other Tenet system accepts. And also, unlike the other 3 Tenet systems, the Vaibhashikas reject the existence of what's called a reflexive cognition. Now, in Buddhist epistemology, or pramana in Sanskrit, what we think of as the mind is actually this constant stream of countless mind states and mental events, each rising and ceasing at every millisecond. And it's through that way that we can see how we can't point out any singular or inherent mind. And so when we categorize the different types of mind states, such as valid cognition, invalid cognition, now within a valid cognition, there's this, usually we say that with any type of mind state, whether valid or invalid, there's always this reflexive cognition, where the mind is aware of itself. You could also call it apperception. But the Vaibhashikas reject that, and they say that there's no such thing. And they use this analogy of the absurdity of such a thing by using a knife. Now, a knife is meant to cut things, but a knife cannot cut itself. So likewise, the mind can perceive external and internal reality, but it cannot perceive itself. And then within the Vaibhashika, there are different denominations, such as the Kashmiri Vaibhashika, the Bactrian Vaibhashika, Madhyadeshan Vaibhashika. But their differences lie mainly in the monastic ordination lineages, as they teach more or less the same tenet. And then each tenet system has their own interpretation of what the two truths are. So how the Vaibhashikas define the ultimate truth is, say if one were to physically or mentally dissect any phenomenon, and if that phenomenon were still to be found, then it would have an inherent existence, and thus it would fall into the ultimate truth. Whereas if that phenomenon were not to be found, after dissecting it, then it would fall into relative truth. So for example, say if we have a chair, and if we were to physically break it apart, break down the chair, we would not find the chair anymore, as we're only left with its components, such as the backrest, the arms, the legs, and which aren't the chair themselves. Whereas when we go down to the minutest of atomic particles, where there's nothing smaller, and when we can't dissect that into anything else, anything smaller, then that would fall into ultimate truth, as would also mind states. And so after dissecting these, they become discrete entities with an inherent nature. So that's the Vaibhashikas. The second tenet system is called Sutrantikas, or literalist. So the meaning of that is, whereas the Vaibhashikas mainly differentiate the phenomena and abhidharma, the Sutrantikas advocate a very literal interpretation of the sutras. So one of the earliest influences would be Dignaga and his Compendium of Epistemology, and also Chandrakirti's works on epistemology. And so unlike the Vaibhashikas, the Sutrantikas accept reflexive cognition. And one of their reasonings is that when one recalls cognizing things, like when one remembers seeing something from earlier on, that is the result of reflexive cognition, because the mind knows what it saw. Whereas if there were no reflexive cognition, then we would not remember anything. And some of the defining characteristics of the Sutrantika are explained in the works by Gyöngyi Gwarangpa Sunam Sengye, whose works we rely on the most to learn about the tenet systems. And so how he explains it is that they have what he calls the 5 uncommon assertions. And so the first assertion is that when the mind validly cognizes external reality, now since the objective condition serves as the cause of the cognition, and since according to them, any cause and its result can never exist simultaneously, the image that the mind sees at that moment is actually the mind itself and not the outer object. So that's the first assertion. The second assertion is, so since the outer reality cannot be cognized directly, but only through its image, then it becomes an obscure or inevident external reality, rather than evident. And that is the cause, and the result is the cognition. And then the third assertion is any apparent object of a conceptual mind or a non-conceptual dysfunctioning mind is unsubstantiated, and any apparent object of a non-conceptual direct perception is substantiated. And then the fourth assertion is, in external reality, there are subtle aspects and gross aspects. So the gross aspects are all relative truth, and the subtle aspects always fall into the ultimate truth. And then the fifth assertion is the external reality and the direct perception that perceives that reality are subject and object, but only in the conventional sense and not in ultimate reality. And the reason why is that there is no relationship between the two in the ultimate sense, because, as I mentioned earlier, a cause and its result can never exist simultaneously. So these are the 5 defining characteristics of the Sutrantika that no other tenet system asserts. And then their way of categorizing all phenomena is by self-defined phenomena and generally defined phenomena. So self-defined phenomena means anything that is impermanent, compounded, and conditioned. And so since they have an inherent existence, they all fall into the ultimate truth. And generally defined phenomena means anything, things that are abstract concepts and permanent phenomena. And so they all fall into relative truth because one cannot point out and find any of these things because they're simply created by our minds. And then within the Sutrantaka, there are two denominations, which are adherence to the scriptures and adherence to logical reasoning. So the adherence to the scriptures rely mainly on the Abhidharma quotations, and the adherence to logical reasoning rely mainly on epistemology. So the third tenet system is called the Chittamatara, or mind-only school. Now you might have heard of Yogacara, which is basically the same name for the tradition that this tenet system comes out of, but that would usually refer to the more practical teachings, which we would not debate on. But when it comes down to the tenet system, then the mind-only views are to be discussed. So this tenet system started with the texts by Asanga. No, not my cousin, but the 4th century Peshwari scholar Acharya Asanga. And so, whereas the first two Shavakayana tenets advocate external reality as substantiated, this tenet system refutes that, and only the mind is truly established, and not any outer reality. And so they categorize all phenomena into what are called the 3 characteristics, which are imputed characteristics, extrinsic characteristics, and absolutely established characteristics. So imputed characteristics here means phenomena whose conventional designation is imputed upon its appearance and not the object in and of itself. So what the Chittamatara say is that all external reality that we cognize is actually the result of our own mental latencies. And without any mental latencies to cause them, they will not appear to us. So therefore, all external reality is actually created by our own minds. So when the mind cognizes external reality, we conventionally designate objects. But if we analyze, we see that we cannot find any intrinsic existence. So therefore, it's simply imputed. And then the extrinsic characteristic means something that is ultimately powered by a cause. And so with external reality out of the picture, that leaves the mind, which is the only thing that can arise from a cause, thus making it extrinsic. So basically this characteristic refers to the mind states and mental events. And then the third characteristic means that which is established in the absolute reality, which is emptiness. And so within the Chittamatara, there are 2 denominations, which are the true aspectarians and the false aspectarians. So when the mind cognizes imputed characteristics, now although we cannot validly cognize any external reality since they have no intrinsic existence, what we see is a mere appearance to the mind. So the true aspectarians, they advocate that the appearance that the mind sees is actually the mind itself, and therefore truly established. Whereas the false aspectarians say that the image that the mind sees is not the mind at all. And then the Chittamatara, as a Mahayana school, refers to 8 rather than 6 mental consciousnesses, as is common to all other Buddhist tenet systems. So along with the 6 consciousnesses of the senses, there are also afflicted mental consciousness and substratum consciousness, or alaya in Sanskrit. So the afflicted mental consciousness means that which is preoccupied by any afflictive emotion, such as grasping. And substratum consciousness means is a sort of neutral storehouse for the mental latencies and unripened karma. And so we only study the lower 2 tenets, but they don't survive as lineages of practice. But within the Mahayana, there are those who still do rely on the teachings of the Yogacara philosophical school, and thereby the mind-only tenet views. Now, these first three tenet systems are all what we call advocates of substantialism, because whether it's gross external reality, or the minutest of atomic particles, or just the mind alone, they all substantiate something. But for the fourth tenet, the Madhyamaka, or middle way tenet system, nothing is substantiated at all. Not atomic particles, nor the mind, not even the ultimate truth itself. Nothing has an inherent existence. Now, as a tenet system, it was pioneered by the 2nd century Indian scholar Nagarjuna, when, after reviving the full extent of the Prajnaparamita teachings, he then composed his 6 major treatises on the Madhyamaka philosophy, which includes the root verses of the middle way, called wisdom. So when the Buddha taught about his middle way, as is more universally known, he was mainly referring to the lifestyle or conduct of the middle way, and not living in the extremes. But the middle way here refers to the higher philosophical view that he taught in the Mahayana teachings. So this middle way view means to be free from the 2 limiting extremes, which are nihilism and eternalism. So we do accept that everything that we validly cognized is cognized in the conventional sense. So we don't say that there is nothing. We do accept the conventional functional mode of appearance. But when it comes down to the ultimate reality phenomena, we see that there is nothing to be found as a basis of grasping, thus avoiding eternalism. And so when analyzing the reality phenomena, we understand that everything is free from the 4 fabrications, which are free from existence, free from non-existence, free from both existence and non-existence, and free from neither existence nor non-existence. And so the whole point of that is, instead of trying to find out some objective nature in anything we perceive, we instead go down to the root, which is the grasping itself, by stopping all 4 ways of grasping, and which leads to the ultimate liberation. And so we, as advocates of Madhyamaka, have a way of saying that as long as one believes something is substantiated, there's no liberation. Because grasping is always the root cause of samsara. And so the way the Madhyamaka categorizes all phenomena is simply by the ultimate truth and the relative truth. So the definition of each is the truth seen through the perfected vision, and the truth seen through the vision with artifice, which doesn't mean we're deliberately making it up, but it's the effect of the obscurations that we have yet to purify. And so the first one means that what the Aryans, or realized beings with their perfected vision of truth, exclusively see is the ultimate truth, and what we, wandering beings with our as yet unpurified vision, see is only relative truth. Now, as for denominations within the Madhyamaka, there are Prasangika and Svatantrika. Now, in the 5th century, the Indian scholar Buddha Balita composed a commentary on Nagarjuna's root text, in which he elaborates on the method of prasanga, or consequentialism. So what that means is, when understanding the view of the ultimate view of emptiness, since there is nothing to grasp onto, one simply states the consequences of any assertions that advocates of other tenet systems would lay down, that any assertion leads to grasping, thus one cannot assert anything. So we use methods of prasanga to arrive at non-grasping by challenging logical and spiritual consequences. But then his, Buddha Balita's contemporary, Bhaviveka, composed his own commentary on the root text, in which he criticized Buddha Balita's view with his own method of Svatantrika. Now, what he asserted is that simply stating consequences was insufficient, and to generate a valid comprehension of emptiness, one must use syllogistic reasoning, working with assertions. So Svatantrika would literally mean autonomist, which means Madhyamaka that relies on autonomous inferences for conventional reasoning. So Bhaviveka was the first scholar to actually distinguish the Svatantrika view from the Prasangika view. And then similarly, later on in the 7th century, Chandrakirti is regarded as the first scholar to actually distinguish the Prasangika view. And so there is no actual difference between the Prasangika and Svatantrika when it comes to the view itself, but only in methodology and the way of presenting it. And for us, Tibetan Buddhists, we all follow the Madhyamaka, and within that, generally the Prasangika reasonings and methods. Now, since the first two tenets are not upheld anymore, one might wonder, are they even relevant anymore? Why do we study any of the other three tenets if we all follow Madhyamaka? Now, what I feel is that they all serve as a framework for exploring Buddhist philosophy and psychology. So when we enter the Dharma, although the Madhyamaka view is the highest, our view that we have now is not that. We have a way of seeing things that could fall into Vaibhashika or Sutrandaka, because they correspond to our habitual way of thinking and perceiving. So we challenge our habitual way of thinking and interpretations of the Dharma by bringing these views into our own analysis and to check if such a view could arise or not within one, and to challenge any unchecked assumptions. So for example, we would first learn about differentiating the different phenomena of the 18 dhatus, or the 5 skandhas, which make up the world as we know through the Vaibhashika teachings. But then we would see how abstract concepts and generalized characteristics are all understandably subjective and existent only in the mind through the Sutrandaka. And then, as we progress in our study and contemplation, we see the bigger picture of how the mind plays a much bigger role, and that even the objective, the external reality, is simply created by our own minds and mental agencies. And then, when we go deeper, we see that even the mind itself is nowhere to be found, that there is nothing to grasp onto, which leads to the ultimate view of voidness, as what liberates us from all grasping and suffering. So we use these frameworks for logical reasoning and analysis as a skillful means, but not based on the belief that enlightenment can be reached simply through intellectualization, but to free ourselves from the intellectual blocks and misconceptions to the direct realization that is needed for awakening. And so therefore, it's not just a theory, but it's a whole process of study, contemplation, and cultivation to develop such comprehensive wisdom. And so in our windy Buddhist universities like Dzongsar, we take about a whole decade or more to study these tenet systems by covering the 18 great treatises. And so I hope that what I've shared today provides at least a short introduction into our tradition of studies. And I wish all my Dharma friends and family in Seattle good health, happiness, and to flourish in the study and practice in the Holy Dharma. Thank you.